Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the African Chessboard number 23, August 14th, 2026. Here are the 3 questions we will examine in this program. Why is the French government so relentless against the rights of free thinkers who denounce its international negligence? Can Africa and South America bring themselves to accept the installation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in the South Atlantic? Finally, does the imperial terrorism plaguing Africa carry an alternative political project to the construction of the United States of America that was dreamed of? The United States of Africa that the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism dreamed of for a very long time? Without further ado, let's tackle the first question. Why is the French government so relentless against the rights of free thinkers who denounce its international negligence? From the outset, let's note that there is an ideal France which, for several decades, seems to have literally slipped beneath the oceans. An ideal France that has disappeared, an ideal France that, seems to no longer exist. It's the France of great minds, of great thinkers, the France of La Fontaine's fables, the fable of René Descartes, the France of Blaise Pascal, the France of the Enlightenment, of Rousseau, Diderot, D'Alembert, the France of Voltaire, the France of Victor Hugo, the author of the Contemplations, the France of the French Revolution, which inspired so many other peoples of the world who love freedom, the France of the historic resistance against the dark forces of Nazism and fascism, the France of Jean-Paul Sartre, that profound thinker about whom Charles de Gaulle once told a famous anecdote, insisting that one simply does not strike a man like him. It is a legacy that remains deeply significant. This France, which was able to win the hearts not only of several remarkable individuals on this planet, but also of several peoples of the world, has resolutely disappeared under the blow of another France. A France in full autocratic drift, a France in full contempt for the genius of the mind, a France that has become completely allergic to critical thinking, a France that hunts down political dissidents, that hunts down political difference, a France in the process of ideological standardization, a France fallen under the spell of this harmful image, whose negativity the philosopher Herbert Marcuse deployed in its entirety in his fine work, One-Dimensional Man. For several years now, and this has accelerated, especially since President Emmanuel Macron came to power, France has been cracking down on the rights of free thinkers who denounce its international failures. These are names that by now cannot have escaped anyone's notice. Joining me for this discussion today are Xavier Moreau, Franklin Nyamsi, and yours truly. We are also very pleased to be joined by Natalie Yamb, as well as Zenia Fedorova. These are names you recognize. They are either journalists, intellectuals, activists, or militants, whose only fault has been, since Emmanuel Macron came to power, not to share his opinion on the way world affairs are handled, on the Ukrainian conflict, on the Palestinian conflict, on the imperial terrorist conflicts in Africa. The figures I just mentioned, and the list is not exhaustive, have found themselves holding an opinion different from that of the French government. For example, regarding the Ukrainian crisis, instead of succumbing to the convulsive Russophobia of Emmanuel Macron, who literally behaves like a warlord, a warmonger using Ukrainian cannon fodder to advance the ambitions of Western hegemony, of which he himself is an agent, whether it's the crisis of African terrorist destabilization, or an Emmanuel Macron who at first recognized France's responsibility in the destabilization of Libya and the Sahel, and in the artificial organization, therefore, of the failure of African states, what we observe today is an unprecedented hardening, an intolerable hardening of the French Republic, especially under Emmanuel Macron, towards the exercise of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. At the core of a truly free society, we find 2 essential pillars: the freedom of belief, which allows us to hold our own convictions, and the freedom of objection, which empowers us to challenge the status quo and voice our dissent. The righteous of France are suffering, yet there are articles whether in the Constitution, the French constitutional text of 1789, or the French Constitution, well, of October 1958, which are supposed to protect the freedom of thought, the freedom of expression, and to regulate it. Article 11 of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1789, Article 1 and Article 34 of the Constitution of October 4th, 1958, protect the freedom of thought, expression, and opinion. And the French legislator, since 1789, has been quick to point out that these freedoms, which are notably protected by the texts of the constitutional bloc, if they were to be the subject of, well, excessive use, the arbitration should belong to the courts. With Emmanuel Macron, and notably with the implementation from 2024 of a so-called law on interference, it is now the French government that replaces the judges, that replaces the judicial power in the examination and assessment of the use that citizens make of their freedom of thought, their freedom of expression, their freedom of opinion. It is no longer the judges of France who say whether Franklin Nyamsi has made an abusive use of his freedom of thought, of his freedom of expression, whether Nathalie Yam has made an abusive use of her freedom of thought or expression, whether Remy Seba or whether Xenia Fedorova or whether Xavier Moreau have made an abusive use of their freedom of expression. It is now the President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, sitting literally as an inquisitorial judge, flanked by his ministers of the Interior and of the Economy and Finance, who decree who should be hindered, who should lose the use of their assets and economic goods because of their intellectual difference. It is the collapse of the rule of law in France. So why all this? Quite simply because the French government, the French political elite have lost the battle of ideas. The battle of ideas. French neocolonialism and imperialism have been defeated on the media ground, on the intellectual, theoretical, even spiritual ground, by anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, by the critical thinking of those very people who do not submit to the Vulgate that, well, the West wants to impose on the entire planet. It is the intellectual defeat of French neocolonialism, which is unfortunately compensated for by its excessive violence. Let's move on without further delay to the second subject of this program. Can Africa and South America resolve to accept the installation of NATO in the South Atlantic? NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. At first glance, this question might also seem absurd, a bit far-fetched. NATO, defining itself as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Article 6 of the North Atlantic Treaty of 1949, very clearly indicating NATO's operational zone, namely North America, Europe. Back then, in 1949, the French departments of Algeria, the North Atlantic islands located north of the Tropic of Cancer. When you have a clear idea of NATO's geographical sphere, asking whether Africans and South Americans should, well, accept the installation of NATO in the southern part of the Atlantic Ocean is literally like begging the question. It's like literally pushing at an open door. Yet, in reality, in practice, what must we realize? The greatest military power in NATO, the very one that commands and dictates NATO's main directions, namely the United States of America, has gradually equipped itself with more than 830 military bases around the world. And these 830 military bases around the world haven't just settled in the preferred zone of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, namely the zone we specified, North America, Europe, all the North Atlantic islands north of the Tropic of Cancer. If you look at a map, that's really exactly in the North Atlantic, north of the Tropic of Cancer. But there's something else that needs to be observed. Let's look at the number of countries. I had some fun noting the number of countries where Western troops are present. Officially or unofficially, in 2022, Libya, Mauritania, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Gabon, Chad, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Kenya, Botswana, South Sudan, Madagascar, Seychelles, Kenya, Somalia, Somaliland, Djibouti, Eritrea. How can we, on one hand, claim that NATO's zone of influence is in the North Atlantic Ocean, in the northern part, and on the other hand, explain this expansion of American, British, and French military bases in all the countries I just mentioned in particular? There's a contradiction because while NATO was supposed to stay in the north, we can clearly see that NATO is expanding not only to the east, which is at the root of the, Russo-Ukrainian war, but the Russian Federation also points to a massive NATO intrusion into the Pacific, literally trying to encircle all the countries in the world, and notably China and Russia. We can concretely see that NATO has never stopped since 1949 expanding across the entire Earth and notably wanting to control the southern part of the Atlantic Ocean. We shouldn't forget the war. Well, that took place in 1982, the Falklands War, the 74-day operation, during which the United Kingdom attacked Argentina to impose the presence of NATO troops in the southern part of the Atlantic Ocean. Numerous military operations continue to be carried out by NATO warships in the South Atlantic. The Gulf of Guinea, which is one of the richest maritime regions in the world, is constantly corralled, threatened, and the object of geostrategic and geotactical intimidation by the armed forces of NATO countries. We can therefore say in an indisputable way that NATO is spreading southwards. Even if legally the South is no longer part, is not part, has never been part, the South Atlantic, of NATO's preferred domain, of its domain of preponderance. Africa and South America must not accept this standardization, this domination. They must set up a joint mechanism, a South Atlantic alliance to prevent Western hegemony over the great ocean that unites Africa and Latin America. It is the responsibility of the great powers of West Africa in particular, and of Latin America, Eastern Latin America, to set up this organization and to equip themselves with armies capable of patrolling and monitoring the Atlantic Ocean, just as NATO armies patrol and monitor the North Atlantic. The South Atlantic must be under the hegemony of African countries and Latin American countries. It is an imperative of this century. Let's conclude this program with the third question. Is the imperial terrorism raging in Africa carrying an alternative project to the construction of the United States of Sub-Saharan Africa, the great dream of the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism? First, very quickly, what is imperial terrorism? It is the hybrid war, my dear friends, that is currently being waged against Africans. This war consists of using terrorism as a means of advancing imperialist interests. Imperialism is an insatiable appetite. It is voracity. This propensity, notably Western and Middle Eastern, to seize the riches of the entire world under all sorts of pretexts and alibis. For 600 years, Africa has been in the grip of this voracity of Western and Middle Eastern powers, with its gold, its manganese, its coltan, its uranium, its oil, its lithium, and everyone knows it. But what is the stated project of imperial terrorism? In Africa, it claims to be jihadism. That is to say, a new version of the beautiful Muslim religion that Africans have known and practiced freely now for several centuries. Under the guise of jihadism, in reality, the imperialist powers that created, financed, publicized, and armed the main terrorist organizations have been moving since the destruction of Libya in 2011 toward the total destabilization of the Sahel, the Gulf of Guinea, the Congo Basin, the Zambezi Basin, always under the veil, under the pretext of preaching an Islam that Africans, do not need since they already practice it themselves, and moreover, for a very large part of them, an Islam of peace, an Islam of love, a spiritual Islam, and besides, for a very large part of them, an Islam of peace, an Islam of love, a spiritual Islam, an Islam absolutely compatible with life in the secular republic. So, what is the real project of imperial terrorism? It is not the jihadist project, it is the project of recolonizing the continent. It is therefore urgent that all African institutions, the African Union, like the Alliance of Sahel States, ECOWAS, CEMAC, ECCAS, SADC agree on this finding, and that there be a sovereign decision, a surge of dignity from the African peoples and their leaders to, in unison, put in place defense mechanisms for the African continent comparable to that of, the unified forces of the Alliance of Sahel States. It is an urgent matter because the racist myth developed by Forster, that of an Africa without Africans, is being realized with the tactical, strategic depopulation of Africa by terrorist groups behind which are Western and Middle Eastern multinationals. And the voracity of capitalism, of the everlasting Western capitalism responsible for the slave trade, colonizations, pseudo-decolonization, and today for this strategy of order through chaos. Thank you.